What can we do? Poverty as defined by capability. How do we define poverty? It looks different for each of the 46 million people currently below the federal poverty line. And once we define it, how do we measure it? There's no one good way to do it, and different measurements yield different results. But in order to try to solve poverty, we must first try to decide how to define it and how to measure it.
John Iceland gives us a basic definition of poverty, economic or income deprivation. This is consistent with the official poverty measure used in the United States, which creates an income threshold below which a person is considered poor. For a family of 4 in 2017, this threshold was $24,600. But looking only at income for both defining and measuring poverty can leave out key factors that affect a person's actual standard of living. For this reason, poverty should be defined in the context of capability failure, that is, failure to achieve certain basic functionings. It should be measured using a combination of the capability measure, supplemental poverty measure, and official poverty measure. This will more accurately portray who is really living in poverty in the United States. Iceland's definition of poverty as income deficiency certainly has its merits. For one, it's easy to understand and agree on. Although one could argue that external factors like geographic location and non-discretionary expenses come into play, the official poverty measure is widely accepted. For another, it's easy to measure, even if the more complex supplemental poverty measure is used. Also, income is a large factor in whether a person is or is not living in poverty, so it makes sense to define poverty as lack of sufficient income.
The first method of measuring poverty using income is the official poverty measurement, or OPM for short. Hands down the most simplified tool we have. The OPM compares households to the federal poverty line based only on their gross annual pre-tax income and nothing else. It provides a threshold, 3 times the calculated thrifty food basket. That is 3 times what is contained in the lowest cost food plan. If a family meets this, they are considered to be doing well. If not, then they're poor. The simplicity of the OPM helps for longitudinal purposes. It helps determine where individuals stand on just income levels, which thus makes it even easier to compare stats from year to year. At this point, some may argue that poverty is not just about money. They might be bothered by the OPM. The OPM disregards the fact that other variables play a role in whether or not someone is in poverty. For example, it doesn't take into account geography, as some areas have more opportunities, also the fact that increased standard of living varies. It doesn't take into account non-discretionary expenses like taxes, or even government benefits like welfare. Lastly, the OPM is binary, meaning there's no way to tell just how poor people really are, and or how long they are in poverty. All we get is that the poor exist. As a response to those concerns came the supplemental poverty measure. The SPM provides a threshold dollar amount for food, clothing, shelter, and utilities, 33% times 1.2 for extra room. Those that do not meet this threshold are considered to be in poverty. Like the OPM, the SPM includes gross annual pre-tax income. However, it also includes in-kind benefits and takes away non-discretionary expenses. There are several perks to the SPM. First, it is a much more refined measurement tool compared to the OPM. It includes many more variables that would impact an individual's household. Secondly, it gives us a better read on whether or not these government programs aimed at aiding those in poverty are actually beneficial.
But what the income definition fails to do is tell us what a person is capable of doing with the income they receive. Defining poverty as a lack of adequate income ignores the fact that what is adequate for one person may not be adequate for another, even if they make the same amount of money. One may have large medical expenses, a higher rent payment, or high transportation costs to get to work. All of these would impede a person's ability to convert income into basic functionings like food. On top of this, income is only one factor in a dignified life. Despite this, income is still valuable if viewed from a slightly different angle. Instead of defining poverty as just a lack of income, we could partially define poverty as a failure to convert income into basic functionings. This then accounts for the differences in capability while still looking at income. In fact, Amartya Sen argues that looking at income accounts for one of the failures of the capability method. He said, quote, "The basic failure that poverty implies is one of having minimally adequate capabilities, even though poverty is also inter alia a matter of inadequacy of the person's economic means, or the means to prevent capability failure." Sin defines poverty as the failure to meet a set of basic functionings, or things necessary to lead a dignified human life. Nussbaum defines capabilities as, quote, answers to the question, what is this person able to do and to be? This method emphasizes the importance of choice and ability in defining poverty. For example, a basic functioning could be eating enough to not be malnourished. A woman who does not have the capability to buy enough food would not achieve this basic functioning. However, a man who is choosing to fast for a religious or social reason is also not achieving this functioning. But one of these people has a choice in this matter, and sin says we should not consider him poor. Instead of looking at whether or not people meet some minimum threshold, we should look at whether people have the capability to do so. Those who do not, we consider poor. There are many advantages to using the capability method to define poverty. For one, it recognizes that a person's financial situation is both a product of his internal capabilities and the external context in which he lives. A distinction between the two is important in defining poverty because it can more accurately show us where the capability failure is.
The capabilities approach to defining poverty also allows us to measure it without even considering income. It looks at what we need to live a dignified human life. An individual must have all capabilities from a list of 10 in order to reach the goal mentioned earlier. Those 10 include life, bodily health, bodily integrity, senses, imagination, thought, emotions, practical reason, affiliation, other species, play, and control over one's environment.
But perhaps the most important advantage to the capability method, at least as defined by Nussbaum, is that it recognizes that just having enough to survive doesn't mean a person isn't poor. The capabilities approach focuses on the protection of areas of freedom so central that their removal makes a life not worthy of human dignity. Nussbaum's definition includes 10 basic freedoms, all of which have to be met to live a dignified life.
Nussbaum reiterates the importance of these when she says, quote, all are distinctive, and all need to be secured and protected in distinctive ways. The capabilities approach really highlights the idea of freedom. These capabilities that we have are substantial freedoms, meaning that there are a total set of things we can freely choose or select to do. In a sense, an individual can choose what they do with said capabilities. Another good aspect of this tool is that although the threshold can vary from place to place, the capabilities will remain the same. Lastly, the capabilities approach allows you to look at and study specific things that places need help in. For example, instead of solving some larger issue such as income gaps, you can look at a specific area's problems involving bodily integrity.
Like any definition, the capability approach has its flaws. A major flaw is that people have different ideas of what is necessary to live a dignified life. What one person might consider vital, another may think is only sort of important. Perhaps its biggest flaw is that it is complicated both to define and then to implement as a measure because it is so subjective.
Another argument against this means of measurement might be that it undermines how valuable money really is. You need money to buy things such as food and clothing.
Although there are several good ways of defining poverty, the best way to define it is in two parts: a lack of adequate income and the failure to achieve certain basic functionings. As we discussed earlier, adequate income is not income above a set threshold. Rather, it refers to having enough income to convert that into basic functionings. Taken together, these two definitions of poverty more accurately describe what it really is: the inability to live a dignified human life.
Poverty must then be measured, because each method of measuring it has its pros and cons. Using a combination of the official poverty measure, the supplemental poverty measure, and the capabilities approach will yield the most accurate measurement of the population living in poverty. All in all, poverty is subjunctive. Its definition and how we view the concept will change over time. There's always going to be someone in the bottom, and that we cannot necessarily change. What we can do, however, is take the time to understand why there is a bottom. We need to ask the questions, figure out the variables, and take steps from there.